Good morning and welcome to Creative Brain Week Day 2. I'm Dominic Campbell and here is...
Hi, I'm Melissa Chan. Good morning everyone online and in person in the room. Thank you for joining us this morning on a Sunday morning.
So today, Day 2 at Creative Brain Week is all about business and innovation. It's all about the creative brain in action. And we have a busy program which will look at those kind of issues. We have different speakers, different types and styles of presentation. So I hope you can join us throughout the day. And Melissa's just going to give you a quick overview of what's happening today.
Yeah, so today we'll be looking at business and innovation, the creative brain in action. We'll look at the application of creativity and neuroscience in tech and innovation, business and care. Apart from highlighting some of the trends, gaps, opportunities in the area of business and innovation in brain health, my hope is for our sessions today to inspire the audience in the room and online to really rethink how we are reaching end users and how we can make technology more inclusive and accessible across different use cases. You want to introduce our first speaker today, Dominic?
I do. So we're joined by a few people today, but in this first session, we're joined by Richard Riley. Richard Riley is Professor of Neural Programming in the Trinity Lab in Trinity College, Dublin. And we're going to hand over to Richard, and then we're going to expand on some of the things that Richard introduces and talks about. So, if we can go over to Richard.
Good. Hello. Hopefully you can hear me well, Dominic.
We can hear you perfectly well, and we can see you. Good morning, sir. How are you?
Morning, Richard.
Fantastic. Good. Thank you very much for the invitation, and apologies that I can't be with you today, but hopefully I'll be able to explain the reason for that in the next few minutes in my presentation. Let me just share some slides here with you, and I can follow on the theme that Dominic and Melissa have just outlined, which is, I suppose, technology and innovation and how we might do that and interact and improve in that area, particularly in the area of neurosciences and dealing with brain health and medicine. And I've titled this talk in kind of connecting neuroscience, neural engineering, which is my specialty, and clinical medicine. And neural engineering is a relatively new field in the last number of decades in biomedical engineering, and it's important because it brings together, I think, a number of distinct areas that many of us may not have realized could be interacting together in positive ways. The first theme, obviously, is neuroscience, one of the reasons why we're hosting this particular conference, and the great boom in the interest in neuroscience. And we understand a little bit more about how the brain processes signals, which is fantastic. But also from an engineering point of view, there's been some great advances that we can actually bring to, as Melissa just outlined, how we can bring technology to make it usable for both patients, but also for clinicians making diagnosis and recommending different types of solutions. And that is that we have new mathematics that we can apply now to data that we can record from the body and specifically from the brain to be able to interrogate and understand how the brain is processing information in different ways. And we also then have very interesting new biomaterials that we can place inside the body, and those materials can last for long periods of time, and they can aid in terms of diagnosis, being able to record signals, or we can actually stimulate different parts of the brain or different parts of the body to have some therapeutic effect. So we've been able to bring together technical areas and neuroscience areas, which has been terrific. And of course, the piece that's missing from the screen and the puzzle, of course, is that we need a clinical reason for doing this. And of course, as we all know, the increasing age profile of individuals these days brings about it different challenges that we need to be able to look for different solutions, particularly, for example, for neurodegenerative diseases. So neural engineering kind of brings together all of these different, would have been disciplines before, to try to interact together. And of course, with that kind of interaction, we need better vocabulary to be able to interact these different constituents. My own area is what's called clinical neural engineering, and I've been incredibly fortunate to work with some fantastic clinicians and physicians around the teaching hospitals. In Dublin, we have 5 big teaching hospitals. So with the departments of neurology, psychiatry, and electrophysiology, with those hospitals in a range of different areas. Looking at active implantable devices, looking at aging, particularly looking at cognitive aging through interesting, innovative ways, being able to understand the brain during neurodevelopmental phases, and also the area of movement disorders. And that involves a number of different interests. And movement disorders is a theme I was going to use as an example here very briefly to describe what we're working on. But our focus is really collaborating with clinical colleagues across a whole spectrum of different disciplines: gerontology, neurology, otolaryngology, respiratory medicine, trying to come up with different mathematical methods to understand neurological function, and also ways to be able to see how we might be able to best predict different interventions, what might work better for certain individuals, different personalized modulation principles that might also affect positively individuals in different ways. And also, how can we record signals, particularly at scale, and translate them not just to be working in the laboratory, but actually work in both the clinic, and more importantly, can we actually get them to work at home as well? So gathering large volumes of data. I mentioned one particular area that I'm particularly interested in movement disorders. And the reason for that, I think, I find human movement fascinating. It's a very complex process. We could be walking across a very sandy beach, as we see here. We could be carrying out very intricate dance moves, for example. We have great manipulation in our upper body to be able to do different things and carry out activities of daily living. But it allows us to be able to measure those kind of movements in many, many different ways. And we can also understand the complexity that the neural processes involved in movement at also different levels. So it's a very fascinating area. And of course, for all of us, and many of us, it works seamlessly. It presents no problems. But for certain individuals, and we can think of individuals with Parkinson's disease, for example, have great problems with movement. People with essential tremor have great problems with movement also. And there's another condition which I'm fascinated by, an area called dystonia. This is probably the third most common movement disorder that exists at the moment worldwide. And we've all experienced some form of dystonia, and probably the best example of that would be writer's cramp. We've all experienced writer's cramp at some time in our lives. But this is a very strange condition. There are many different types or phenotypes of dystonia, and they're not well understood how they come about. Often they can start with a fixed posture problem. So we see that in picture B, the abnormal foot posture. But then it can develop into something a little bit more complex. So it can extend from the foot of the arm into the head and the neck region. And unfortunately, as we see in picture D, it can actually then translate into something which really affects gait and mobility. What's really interesting here is that many individuals who are suffering from dystonia up until the 1980s were often diagnosed as having a psychiatric problem as opposed to a neurologic problem. And many individuals, unfortunately, were institutionalized for many, many years without really having a psychiatric condition at all. And it was just poor vocabulary that was being described from one clinician to another. And my area in dystonia is really being fascinating. And for that reason, I wanted to talk about one particular area which I think has been important for us to make any kind of progress on that area. And that is learning the vocabulary of another discipline. So I've been working there in dystonia for probably 25 years or so. I've been attending grand rounds in clinical institutions, going to journal clubs with clinicians and neurologists in particular themes, attending outpatients, meeting patients with my students, attending training sessions, often video training sessions of difficult cases that neurologists have difficulty understanding the problems of dystonia, providing specialist registered training to individuals who are in neurologists, and attending clinical conferences. And that can be strange for somebody who comes from an engineering background like myself. And in fact, I was often quite criticized by my academic colleagues that really I shouldn't be focusing on these things. I should be focusing on engineering solutions, as opposed to trying to understand the vocabulary of actually another discipline. And this really is the theme that I want to kind of bring across, and maybe something to think about the rest of the day and also for the rest of the week that Dominic and colleagues have put together for you. We're often thinking about also silos in academia and silos in medicine, and how often we have very focused thinking that really isn't fit for purpose, and it doesn't allow different disciplines or within discipline communication that really should exist. And often the phrase that's often talked about is a jack of all trades is a master of none. But in fact, that's not the full phrase at all. The full phrase is a jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. And I think this is something that I would like to get across today, and that is there's far too much emphasis and career advice on focusing on one area in your discipline, as opposed to developing maybe a spectrums of interests. And I think it's through the spectrum of interests that we can actually make a real impact. We can only have to think about COVID these days, of how we're all understanding a little bit more about PCR tests, the reads for antigen tests, the vocabulary associated with this particular pandemic, and how the great progress in terms of vaccinations and how that has actually come about in such a relatively short period of time. So my focus really to you is to increase vocabulary of other disciplines, maybe go outside your comfort zone to be able to work with colleagues in different disciplines. Just in my own case, in the impact theme of movement disorders in dystonia, we've been very successful in publications and patents and licensing to the medical device sector. But really, I think it's the real success has been creating new minds that are now aware of the ability to be able to work with engineers and clinicians together to be able to develop new understanding of how the brain is changed in these particular individuals and what we might be able to do about it. So we've been very successful in the number of PhD students and MD students and MSc students, and I think that's probably the biggest impact that we've had in this area, not our publications or patents in technical solutions. I suppose I've really taken this area on, and a number of years ago I helped found a journal, an IEEE journal for translational engineering and health and medicine. The IEEE is the biggest professional society of engineers in the world, and they agreed to have this new journal in their catalogue of journals, and I'm now the editor-in-chief of that journal. And that really is to bring different disciplines together, researchers, health providers, but also industry, to be able to publish results and best practice of how to work together, and also solutions which were developed in conjunction with each other. And the reason, unfortunately, I can't be with you today is that I have a training session with new associate editors from Asia who are on our journal today, and I'm participating in that later on this morning. So my message to you, and hopefully that sets us in a little bit for some of the discussions that we may have, and also your discussions today and later in the week, is working together, breaking down boundaries and using new vocabulary to be able to explain and understand other disciplines to see how you can make an impact in different ways. I thank you for your attention. I leave you with my own website and email address if you're interested in any of these areas, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Richard, thank you so much. It's a brilliant way of setting up Sunday, and it carries many of the themes that began yesterday into today. How do we cross over? How do we work across institutions? How do we cross over language? How do we discover things that are emergent? And I'm going to introduce Melissa a little bit more now to explain kind of why. So, Melissa, you work as a service designer and a social entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. Explain what a service designer does.
Yeah, no, I really, thank you, Richard, for that presentation. I mean, I really, align with the idea of working outside silos, the whole idea of collaborative working to be able to scale solutions. In order to develop a solution and to think about scaling something, a lot of that is about working with different stakeholders, from the very start working with, for example, if you're developing solutions for people living with dementia, working with individuals with lived experience, working with their carers, working with the service providers, being able to pull different components of a problem together and trying to ideate and to see what kind of solutions we can come out with. So a lot of the time that I spend is with the end users, really understanding the problem. So a large focus is uncovering problems.
What do people want? How do I work with them? That came up a lot yesterday. It came up in terms of education. It came up in terms of developing product. It came up in terms of all sorts of innovation. That really great phrase, Richard, that I'm now going to get tweeted everywhere about, the main job being creating new minds. So it's not only creating new minds by discovering common language across disciplines. It's also using different tools like the periodical, like the magazine that you're developing at the moment. Tell me a little bit about how you make the magazine work, what its aspiration is, and what its intention is.
The intention is really to show off best practice of how solutions which exist in the lab, how they can be translated into the clinic. So we have far too many examples of academic research, which is fantastic, but unfortunately never makes it to have a real impact with patients or providers. One of the things that I'm trying to do at the moment is have a series of grand challenges. So listening from clinicians and providers of what are the challenges that they see. So as a result, technologists can develop solutions to those particular challenges. All too often, we see technologists coming up with what they think is a solution to a problem, but in fact, it's not the real problem that they should be solving. So my emphasis is trying to change that around and have, well, these are the big challenges. If we can solve these challenges, this would make huge impact for the quality of life for different individuals. So in the next number of months, we have special issues looking at cardiology, looking at respiratory medicine, but also looking at intellectual disabilities. So what technologies and interventions could be useful or necessary to improve the quality of life for those with intellectual disabilities or those caring for people with intellectual disabilities?
So does that mean that both of you really are going up this, what I think of as a piano keyboard? So you're constantly going from the individual experience to figuring out the data that says that's a big problem, for the benefit of the majority, and then back to the individual experience, and you're doing this continually?
So in the work that we do, we kind of call it the Scrum Agile methodology. It's in a cycle where we go to the end user, we speak to the end user, we uncover the problems, we try and ideate, develop a solution, test it really quickly. The idea is not to perfect a solution in the area, in the services that we develop, but to bring it to the end user as early as possible to be able to get their feedback on it.
Okay,
and
so
then we go back
loop.
there. So it's a feedback loop.
Yeah. And the feedback loop, the magazine is a feedback loop as well, Richard, is it?
The journal would, exactly, it's a feedback loop. And again, having reviewers that are both from a clinical background as well as from a engineering background provides authors then with good feedback on how to actually improve that manuscript. So as a result, we can publish best practice in that way. And I think, as Melissa has just mentioned, there are now so many new tools that are freely available to be able to have agile working together or this kind of Scrum approach. There really isn't any excuse why we're not using these to be able to build solutions which really work.
And then in the exhibition that's wrapped around this series of presentations and lectures, you can see those sort of feedback loops happening almost in real time. So you have neurodiverse artists that are making up their own creative practice. You have people living with diagnosis of conditions who are learning how to sing together, and almost they work as an instant feedback loop. But what they don't do is scale, and scale's a kind of interesting one for the creative side of the house, I think. Melissa, tell me, you remember the WILD group? Explain WILD group.
Yeah, so WELL stands for the World Young Leaders in Dementia Network. We were a group of young people that were brought together by the UK Science and Innovation Agency about 6 years ago. And the idea is that we bring together people from all sorts of backgrounds, entrepreneurs, creatives, scientists, researchers, clinicians, and when we say young, we are looking at the 39s and below, but we don't discriminate. I think we have a lot of people. A lot of our leaders have stayed on and supported our work, and they're way past, and they acknowledge it, and they're still supportive as mentors now. And the whole idea is for us to come together to look at certain types of problems, form working groups, and to bring in that collaborative working model. I think it also really helps that we have leaders from all around the world. So we have had some projects where together in a working group, we have people from Luxembourg raising funds to look at a project in Malaysia, for example. Yeah, so that helps us move a bit faster. Yeah, which has been great. I mean, the Young Leaders in Dementia Network, the energy, I think the partners that we have as well globally have been really supportive in helping to move that collaborative agenda.
So you're moving between the individual experience and then this piano, but you're also moving it internationally between one country's experience. But when you do that, you're also dealing with very different kind of health systems, healthcare delivery systems, whether it's a business model or a public, and is that something that's appearing as a challenge? Or?
Yeah, a large part of a lot of the work that we do is the bit on translation, right? How do we bring something to market? How do we scale something? How do we think about all the other components what it means to bring something to market? So from the outreach model, how we reach the end users from the communication model, how do we use the right tone to reach the people that we want to reach, what is the value proposition.
But what your product is a healthcare product, yeah? Or is that behavior change?
It can be a mix. It can
Okay.
be a mix of services. It can be help. Typically, we do a lot of community type of intervention models.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, Richard, with the work that you're doing, you move into so ideas get developed. The journal, for instance, exchanges those. What's the outward-facing piece? Is that into industry and business? But also, what's the research piece? What's the curiosity and the questions?
I think that's very important. So I think with the different authors that we would have, being researchers in labs like my colleagues in Trinity, the research question has to be the most important aspect. And it's trying to find that research question, what's the most relevant question that can be asked with the resources that are available for the particular challenge that's presented. That often can be very difficult. And that may take some time to be able to work together to do that. I think that's why vocabulary and understanding what's in that medical discipline or in the healthcare provider, how they actually deal with things is so important. So being there, working with patients in the clinic or actually working in an end user facility, so important. So getting to understand that research question, that's really what it's all about.
And Richard, when you say resources, do you mean, is it always cash? Is it always money?
No, I don't think so. It could also be time. I think that often the resources of time and also the resources of expertise. Who else do we need to have on this team to be able to come up with a solution? Certainly in my own group, it often is that. It's not cash, it's actually finding people. And we've great difficulty sometimes of finding PhD students or postdoctoral researchers to help on projects. There's just so many projects available and so many opportunities for people these days. Trying to find people to come together and work on projects is often the challenge. It's not usually the financial problem.
And when you're putting those groups of different types of intelligences together, do you spend a lot of time thinking about the culture of the exchange, or?
Yeah, absolutely. That tends to be critical. So, and certainly I can usually spot an early PhD student or a master's student who's not comfortable being in the clinic working with patients, and maybe that wouldn't be a theme for them to continue. Others revel in that. They actually really understand what the challenges are now. And coming back to the lab saying I'm working for those particular people and developing a solution. That's very exciting to see, and how they have that particular interest and passion to develop things further.
Melissa, that echoes some of what you're exploring?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are the same type of conversations that we have on a day-to-day basis. A large part, actually, for us right now is building of culture within the groups that we're working with. The idea of collaborative working. I think the whole being able to take or use the value that every leader has in our network. Some people, for example, for my background and expertise, I look a lot at how communication strategies, the go-to-market strategies, the more outreach and translation bit. But that means that I have to work with my coworkers, my colleagues, to be able to take that science and translate it outwards, right? Mm-hmm. So we all come with different value beyond funding, beyond time, that resource, the knowledge, all of that is an exchange.
And you and I are both part of the Global Brain Health Institute Fellowship and the bigger Atlantic Fellowship, which has the same kind of experiences and challenges of how do we work across boundaries, barriers, experiences, and things that we haven't yet really talked about, like age or those kind of things. The Global Brain Health Institute, one way that it starts to connect is through identifying values, identifying where people connect. Do you find that works for you too?
Yeah, I mean, I love that at GBHI we use the values as an underlying foundation to the way that we work. That's so important because it sets the tone for how we collaborate, how we think, how we problem solve, how we ideate. So I think that is a big part of building the culture of collaboration.
So it starts from how do we walk into the room, what's the values, and where do we go? I'm going to open it up to the audience in a minute if there's any questions. Richard, I'm just wondering, having listened to Melissa, I'm wondering what there might be from your perspective that you might bring into the conversation that we haven't touched on already.
I think one aspect, I think We hear a lot of career advice of people going into a particular discipline, follow your passion, do this and be an expert in this area. And I suppose just to echo the sentiment of maybe branching out, being a little bit more bold and brave to be able to work with other people and not to fear that, okay, maybe my career is a little off kilter here, to actually embrace that. But I think things will actually get and improve enormously for you. And actually, it'll be great fun working with different groups in that way. So I think people need to be brave and bold, and things will come from that.
And I hope you won't mind me saying, but when I first asked you, would you do this, that was part of the conversation we had, where you said, what would I be doing talking on a day about business and innovation? Yes. And we seem to do very well, I think. It is the start of a day where this conversation will only get deeper and broader and richer. I'm just wondering whether there's any questions that want to come in from the room. There's one or two, so we might take those where we've got a minute or two.
Yeah, I want to suggest a product, actually. I have early stage Alzheimer's disease, and because of that, I underwent fairly extensive neuropsychological testing. So there's a lot of data about me. And the data shows that I have a slightly compromised verbal memory and a very good visual memory. Along comes an occupational therapist who says, I'm going to do memory rehab with you, and that involves you in writing everything down. And I'm thinking, hang on, I've just done tests which show that that's not a very good way for me to learn. And it occurs to me, and I keep saying, wouldn't it be very obvious to have an app where you fed in the psychological information about people that then suggested the therapeutic outcomes? And people go, great idea. But nobody ever actually does anything about it. What I think I've realised just now is that it's because it's a different vocabulary, that actually the psychologists don't talk to the OTs, they just kind of each go on in their careers, and that's it. So could you build that app for me, please, by tomorrow?
Creative Brain Week strikes again. Thank you very much. We can do that. And I also think you touched on something really, really significant, which is what type of vocabulary? So Richard was talking about the vocabulary of language, words. But actually, what you can see around the exhibitions is people who are much more fluent in visual vocabulary, much more fluent in the use of imagery. And when we work across countries, it gets really, really interesting for me when I connect with people who deal with a language that is hieroglyphic-based rather than an alphabet. Because actually, nuance and the blurring between what I might think of as being different, specific, seems to be a different sort of process. And yet at the same time, we don't want to blur that process out too much because then everybody gets the same. And as somebody said yesterday, you don't want to live in a bland world. So the diversity in the things is different. We've got time for one more question, I think, just about, if there's another one in the room. There's possibly two, maybe. And while people are moving around, I will learn to fill in a relaxed manner.
I'm curious about the different vocabularies and learning the different vocabularies. I think the one that's striking me most here from both speakers, though, is this, well, Melissa has said it a few times, going to market. That transition from subject-specific knowledge to the whole world of marketing and money. That seems, how difficult is that to use that marketing vocabulary when actually what interests you is helping patients, doing research?
Fantastic question. And I think something that started, do you want to take it? Because I can add.
I mean, I think it starts with the mindset. Where was this, how was this solution created? Where do you want to take it? Often we see solutions, there are a lot of work that's being done. I think as Richard had mentioned earlier, a lot of work that's being done, but we see very little being translated to the market. And maybe for those individuals or the labs or the groups that have created those solutions, going to market wasn't that plan, right? But for those that have that plan in place, I think getting in the right funders, the right stakeholders that believe in that same direction, and being able to be a bit more open with the business language. Because, for example, if you're creating a consumer product, at some point the language that you're using say on your website, on your mobile application, on your materials, have to target the end users that you're looking at. If not, they will not. There will be a mismatch, and they will not be able to identify with your solution. Yeah, so I think, again, I go back to the mindset, because I've seen teams that are able to move out and really scale their solutions out of the labs, and some that are happy. They're happy to maintain research and continue being able to draw in the findings. So it goes with the vision, where you want to go, what that roadmap is, and then being open to speaking in that different language. Yeah.
And I think it also lines us up really beautifully for the next session, actually, which is about all of those kind of issues. And we'll come back to it again today at several points. We'll all come back to it when we start talking about the architecture of cities, which is on Wednesday. And it echoes something that came up yesterday in the final session. So each of these sessions is recorded. Each of them becomes an archive. You can go back and forth eventually through that archive and treat it like a living library. For now, though, I would like to thank Richard Riley and Melissa Chan and you for joining this first session of today. Thank you very much.